What Vladimir Putin did this week crossed a line that the White House had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Volodymyr Zelensky did not hesitate. He responded with precision, with fury, and with a strategic clarity that has left Moscow scrambling to explain what just happened. This is the story the Kremlin doesn't want you to hear. This is the story Washington is still processing. And this is the story that proves once again that Ukraine refuses to be cornered. For months now, there had been signals, not from official Kremlin channels, not from formal diplomatic sources, just signals that Vladimir Putin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and NATO headquarters this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators, the sudden movement of strategic assets, the repositioning of command structures, the surge in encrypted transmissions between Moscow and field commanders, the sudden recall of diplomatic personnel from sensitive regions. All of that went quiet. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, it means something is about to get very, very loud. US satellites had been tracking unusual activity near Russia's western borders for weeks, but the activity had patterns, it had explanations, military exercises, rotational deployments, the kind of noise that intelligence agencies can account for. But then came the silence, 3 days of near-total communications blackout from key Russian military installations. And in the intelligence world, silence is never good news. Early Tuesday morning, NATO reconnaissance assets detected what they described as an unprecedented forward deployment of Russian tactical systems, including mobile launch platforms that had not been activated in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: imminent offensive action, strategic intimidation, or preparation for a decisive gamble. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his strategic posture. And when a nuclear-armed power shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every capital from Washington to Warsaw pays attention. Within hours, intelligence briefings were being delivered to the National Security Council. The Pentagon activated emergency protocols, and in Kyiv, President Zelensky convened his war cabinet for what sources describe as the most tense meeting since the first days of the invasion. What emerged from that meeting would send shockwaves through the Kremlin, because Zelensky didn't wait to see what Putin would do next. He struck first. The warning issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior official after emergency briefing described Putin's move as reckless, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, indicative of internal desperation. The Kremlin's strategy, according to analysts, was designed to paralyze Western decision-making through fear and uncertainty. But strategic paralysis only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, Zelensky's response today was among the most devastating we've seen since the war began. Here's what we know. Within 12 hours of detecting Russia's forward deployment, Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated series of precision strikes deep into Russian-controlled territory. These weren't the limited harassment operations we've seen in recent months. These were surgical, multi-domain attacks, systems and capabilities that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally alter the battlefield. Western officials are now confirming that Ukraine targeted critical command and control nodes, logistics hubs and forward staging areas that Russia had been quietly building up for weeks. The message was clear: Ukraine sees everything, and Ukraine will hit everything. Tonight, Ukrainian military intelligence confirmed that their forces launched precision strikes on at least 14 Russian military targets, including a forward command post that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was coordination of a major offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could execute. They hit ammunition depots, they hit fuel storage facilities, they hit communication relays that were likely preparing to coordinate ground operations. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's forward deployment, the infrastructure that would have made it operational. This is what made Washington's warning so urgent. Putin's gamble wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of escalation that could spiral into something far worse if left unchecked. And Zelensky, understanding that fully, responded with overwhelming force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. Ukraine didn't strike civilian areas, they didn't target symbolic monuments, they hit military command centers, they hit the logistics chains that feed Russian combat power. Multiple sources within NATO have confirmed that Ukraine's strikes were extraordinarily precise, with minimal collateral impact and maximum strategic effect. One senior defense official, speaking on condition of anonymity, said, "This was textbook. Ukraine just demonstrated that they have the intelligence, the capability, and the will to preempt Russian aggression." That changes the calculation in Moscow. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence agencies now believe that Putin's latest move was designed to test the resolve of Western support after months of political uncertainty in Washington and Europe. Putin wanted to see whether the West would falter, whether aid would slow, whether Ukraine would be left exposed, but instead the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't wait for Western permission. They launched a response that was so immediate, so devastating, that even the Kremlin took notice. You don't get Moscow's attention easily, but today Kyiv did. Defense analysts speaking with European media under anonymity describe Putin's shift as strategic probing, a way to identify weaknesses before committing to a larger operation. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both vigilant and lethal. Their strikes were not only precise, they were timed so perfectly that Russian forces had no opportunity to disperse or reinforce. Their timing matters because it shows Ukraine's intelligence capabilities have reached a new level. It shows that Zelensky is not playing defense. He is dictating the terms of this conflict, and that reality is something the Kremlin never anticipated. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian drone units carried out over 30 sorties targeting Russian logistics, forcing emergency evacuations from at least 3 forward operating bases. Ukrainian artillery targeted ammunition storage sites that had been reinforced in the last 2 weeks. Ukrainian cyber units operating remotely reportedly disrupted communications networks used by Russian commanders to coordinate troop movements. This wasn't just retaliation, this wasn't just defense, this was strategic preemption, this was battlefield dominance. And battlefield dominance is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the first months of the invasion. For every advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that erodes Russian momentum. For every escalation Putin has attempted, Zelensky has responded with proportional and often disproportional force. Tonight was no different, except tonight the stakes were higher than they've been in months. Remember, Putin thought this war would last days. He thought Kyiv would fall within the first week. He thought NATO would splinter under pressure. He thought Zelensky would flee. But tonight the exact opposite is unfolding. Kyiv stands stronger than ever. NATO is more unified than at any point since the Cold War, and Zelensky remains in his capital, directing operations that are systematically dismantling Russian military capability 3 years into this conflict. Putin's fundamental miscalculations continue to haunt him. He believed that time was on his side. He believed that Western attention would fade. He believed that Ukraine would exhaust itself. But tonight it is Russia that appears exhausted. It is Russia that is scrambling to explain catastrophic losses, and it is Russia that is watching its strategic gamble collapse in real time. What makes this moment so critical and so volatile is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when he is under extraordinary internal pressure. Military hardliners want escalation, economic advisors want negotiation, regional governors want resources, and the Russian public wants answers about a war that was never supposed to last this long. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a war that has cost Russia hundreds of thousands of casualties and billions in economic damage. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. Tonight's event suggests that Putin may be running out of options. His domestic position, while still formidable, is showing cracks. His military, while still capable, is degraded, and his international isolation, while manageable, is deepening. When a leader in that position gambles, it's because they feel they have no choice, and when that gamble fails, as it did tonight, the consequences can be unpredictable. The White House's statement, now being distributed to allied capitals, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Russian escalation to go unanswered. Administration officials said plainly that Putin's forward deployment was inconsistent with stated commitments to de-escalation. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and we won't tolerate it. You don't usually hear that tone from Washington unless something serious is at stake. The State Department has already initiated consultations with NATO allies. The Pentagon is reviewing additional support packages for Ukraine, and congressional leaders from both parties have issued statements condemning Russia's actions. For a moment at least, Washington appears united, and that unity is exactly what Putin was hoping to avoid. Meanwhile, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a direct, defiant speech tonight. He said, "We do not wait for aggression, we prevent it." He said, "Every meter they try to take, we will make them pay for in blood and steel." And he said, "Tonight, Ukraine proved again that we are not victims, we are warriors, and warriors do not retreat." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky's words were broadcast not just to Ukraine, but to the world. They were a message to Moscow, we are ready. They were a message to Washington, we are capable. And they were a message to history, Ukraine will not be erased. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the forward deployment of tactical systems, Belarus also increased military activity near its border with Ukraine, Russian naval assets repositioned in the Black Sea, Kremlin-aligned media increased propaganda targeting European audiences. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Moscow moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Intelligence analysts are now working to determine whether this is preparation for a spring offensive, a negotiating tactic, or something else entirely. But whatever Putin's intention, tonight's events have complicated his planning. Ukraine's strikes have degraded his forward posture. Western solidarity has been reinforced, and the element of surprise, which Putin clearly hoped to maintain, is gone. Western analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing a major ground offensive designed to capture additional territory before potential peace negotiations. Another is that Putin is attempting to fracture Western support by demonstrating that the conflict can still escalate unpredictably. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to create conditions for a frozen conflict that locks in Russian territorial gains. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't defer to diplomatic timelines. They didn't allow Russia to set the tempo. They struck decisively. And in doing so, they reminded the world that Ukraine, not Russia, controls the momentum of this war. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see whether the West will fracture under pressure. Zelensky wants to show that Ukraine can survive and prevail regardless of external dynamics. Washington wants to prevent escalation into direct NATO-Russia confrontation. And Europe wants to prevent the conflict from destabilizing the continent further. All of these interests are colliding in real time, and the next few weeks will determine which vision prevails. Tonight we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring Russian military communications for signs of response. They say Russian commanders are scrambling to assess damage. They say logistics chains have been severely disrupted. And they say Putin's decision to escalate is likely part of a broader strategy intended to test Western limits before potential diplomatic engagement. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is accelerating. Their response today, swift, precise, and overwhelming, sent a message to Moscow that escalation will be met with escalation. It sent a message to Washington that Ukraine remains a capable, determined ally worthy of continued support. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It disrupted Russian planning, it reinforced Western resolve, and it demonstrated that Ukraine will not be intimidated. What happens next will depend on what the Kremlin does in the next 72 hours. If Putin de-escalates, this moment will be remembered as a failed gamble that strengthened Ukrainian resistance. If Putin doubles down, Kyiv and Washington have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are coordinated. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be uncertain. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating, it means he is choosing his next move carefully, because tonight Vladimir Putin learned something he has learned many times before. Ukraine does not break, Ukraine does not bend, and Ukraine does not wait. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Putin's gamble has failed. Zelensky's response has succeeded. And the world is watching as Ukraine continues to defy the odds. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.